Welcome back. Today we're going to go ahead and finish part number 2 of World War I, Oversimplified by Oversimplified. I loved part 1. Can't wait for part 2. Really quick before we get started, I do have a gaming channel that's pretty new. If you want to check it out, we play some pretty awesome games over there. I post a little more regularly there because those videos just quite frankly take a lot less time to edit, so I can get them out a lot quicker. But anyway, thank you so much. I appreciate you for tuning in. Let's get started. Part 2.
With both sides stuck in a hard stalemate, they knew this war wasn't going to be about taking territory, but about simply wearing each other down. The Allies had plenty of men to expend from its overseas dominions.
Yeah.
And the British also started a naval blockade, so Germany couldn't import stuff, like food. Neither side really wanted a long, grueling
food
war,
is
though,
pretty
so
important.
they both thought of ways to break the deadlock on the Western Front. Idea number 1, new frontiers. When the war first broke out, Australia was quick to take German New Guinea. The Allies also quickly jumped on Germany's colonies in Africa, and particularly in German East Africa, locals were enlisted as soldiers and carriers by both sides, leading to a tragic loss of life for the native Africans.
So basically the strategy there was to liberate or take over, maybe liberate's not the right word, but to invade countries that are under German control and enlist their residents as fighters against Germany. That way you're not expending your own people. Is that the strategy? Am I understanding that correctly? It's an ingenious and also kind of evil strategy. Seems like it would be pretty effective. Although I would be a little worried about defectors there, right? Defectors. I mean, maybe that would be offset by if the German rule wasn't maybe the friendliest. You could take like that liberation approach where you're liberating them. Now let's help us fight the bad guys. I don't know if that's kind of what happened or not, but that would make sense. Otherwise, I'd be pretty worried about people defecting to Germany.
Some new combatants entered the war as well. The Allies' new friends were Italy and Japan. Japan was busy building itself an empire, so it was more than happy to take away German islands and colonies in East Asia. Italy actually had an alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary before the war.
Yeah, it wasn't Japan on a pretty big expansion run at this point in time. They were really wanting to grow their lands and expand their borders.
But after some tense relations, and then the Allies promising to give them some of Austria-Hungary's stuff, they switched sides. Italy opened up a front in the mountains here, but like everyone else, they were stuck in stalemate for most of the war.
Yep.
The Central Powers' new friend was a struggling empire in the Middle East. The Ottomans... The Ottoman were divided on whether to actually join the war or not, since they had been exhausted by the recent Balkan Wars.
Yeah.
Some of the politicians who did want to join went off on their own and fired...
I don't know much about the Balkan Wars. I would love to read into that a little bit more too.
...some shells at Russia. And then came back and said, whoops, looks like we're at war now. The Ottoman entry into the war was of particular concern to the British, since the Middle East was full of oil, and Britain wanted all of that oil. First, the Ottomans tried to attack Russia in the Caucasus Mountains, but they weren't prepared for the cold, and many of them froze to death. Then they crossed the...
How can you go into war? You hear about this time and time again. How can you go into foreign enemy territory knowing the severe weather? I mean, you have to know about it ahead of time. And not prepare yourself at all. Not prepare your soldiers. I mean, what do you think is going to happen when you send them in there with absolutely no winter clothes and insufficient rations? And what do you think the outcome is going to be? You're just throwing lives away at that point for no discernible gain. I don't understand it.
Miles of desert to take the Suez Canal from the British, but that failed too. Then the Allies tried to take the Dardanelles at Gallipoli in a long and hard trench warfare campaign, but that also failed. The Ottomans blamed their initial losses on the ethnic Armenians living within Ottoman territory, and the resulting Armenian genocide led to the deaths of 1.5 million people.
Is that... Oh, okay. I've heard of the Armenian genocide before, but I had no idea the reasoning behind it. So let's listen to that part again really quick here because I want to make sure I heard it.
The Ottomans blamed their initial losses on the ethnic Armenians living within Ottoman territory.
So that failed, and then the Armenians got blamed for it because you need someone to blame.
Then the Germans sent spies into Afghanistan to try to convince the Arab tribes there to rise up in jihad against the British and attack India. But that plan failed, partly because the spies got bored, brewed their own alcohol, and got drunk, which is a bad thing to do in Afghanistan. All these new frontiers hadn't done much to change the war.
You had one job.
Aware that the Allies had more men and supplies than them, the Germans knew they had to do something to break the stalemate. Before the war, there was a big conference that set out the rules of modern warfare. No chemical weapons, no killing civilians. Basically, don't be jerks. The Germans held a meeting and decided to be jerks.
Yeah.
Zeppelin air raids commenced over British cities. They also started attacking the Allied trenches with chlorine gas, and they used submarines to sink civilian ships.
Yeah, I remember
One such
that.
civilian ship was the Lusitania, which had 159 Americans on board when it was sunk, further swaying U.S. opinion against the Germans. Not to be completely unfair to the Germans.
What did that
further
say? Yay, Germany, Germany, please. Someone's about to get liberated. America. Oh, I enjoyed that.
U.S. opinion against the Germans. Not to be completely unfair to the Germans, the Allies also engaged in chemical warfare soon after, and they had been hiding anti-submarine weapons on their civilian ships, which let the Germans justify their attacks.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Austria-Hungary still hadn't dealt with Serbia.
But they didn't know that ahead of time, right? Probably. The chemical warfare is very interesting because, yes, you shouldn't use it. Yes, there are treaties in place against using chemical warfare. It's a horrible thing. It causes absolute horrific deaths and, you know, it's horrible, right? If you're lucky enough to survive, are you really lucky with what you're going to have to live with after that? Once it's used, the big question is it okay to retaliate with it then? And I don't think there's a clear answer there because, you know, it's such a muddy water after that. If you use it back, you're basically kind of justifying the use retroactively, if that makes sense. It makes it less bad that they used it if you use it back against them. But at the same time, if you don't use it back against them, there's no deterrent not to use it, right? If anyone can get away with using it and not have it used on them, then where's the deterrent in that in a war? You're already at war. People are already dying. Where's the deterrent? So that's a very iffy subject that I think I'm pretty divided on, honestly.
So the Central Powers enlisted some help. Bulgaria wished it was bigger and was still bitter about losing the Second Balkan War. The Central Powers promised to make all of Bulgaria's wildest dreams come true if they helped, so they signed on, and together they knocked out Serbia. The Serbian troops retreated through Albania, which was neutral but had some ties to Austria-Hungary. So Austria-Hungary entered Albania in a friendly invasion to chase down the Serbians, many of whom escaped by sea.
A friendly invasion.
And a lot is happening.
We call that a special operation nowadays.
As if they didn't have enough enemies already, Germany added one more to the list. Portugal had been getting a bit chummy with the Allies behind the scenes, and Germany didn't like that one bit. Around the same time, the only sea battle of the war happened. Both sides had a new powerful class of battleships called dreadnoughts, but they were so expensive to build that neither side wanted to risk losing them in a battle. So they kept them in port, except for one time when they had a big fight and a bunch of them got damaged, so they didn't try that again. The UK started conscripting men to the army, so they had plenty.
It's like the equivalent of today's aircraft carriers. They're amazingly powerful, but oh god, they're expensive. You want them as a deterrent, not to actually use. And nowadays, you know, aircraft carriers are heavily guarded. They have a whole freaking armada basically guarding them if they go anywhere near, you know, outside. And that's for a good reason. Those things cost more than some countries.
Of reserves, which is just as well because the Western Front was about to get brutal. The longest and one of the bloodiest battles of the war started when the Germans launched an attack around the French city of Verdun. The French defended it desperately, leading to hundreds of thousands of casualties. Under pressure, the French called on its allies to do something to draw the Germans' attention away, so the British started their own long and brutal fight, the Battle of the Somme, with 60,000 British casualties on just the first day. It was also here that the British first used one crazy brand new piece of sci-fi technology.
That is
the Russians had
crazy
been getting
looking.
pushed back further and further into their own territory, but in response to the French call for help, they began a huge offensive, and did really well until they ran out of supplies and got stuck. Seeing how well the Russians had been doing, Romania decided now would be a great time to jump in and win the war, and then they got pounded. The Greeks were fighting amongst themselves about whether to join the war or not. The king liked the Central Powers, while the Prime Minister wanted to join the Allies. After a brief national schism, during which the country split into two, the king finally abdicated and the country reunited. With Allied help, they began a new offensive. In the Middle East,
let's look at that again. That's very interesting placement there, because I wonder why the reasoning was that each one liked each side. I'd be very interested to know that, because if you look at their position here, they're cornered in on a land front. They're surrounded by hostile powers, basically. And they got a lot of sea in between them and to the east. That is plenty of coastline for an attack from any of these guys. So it's quite interesting that they decided to go with the Allies in the end, because it seems like they're extremely vulnerable to the other side here.
Allied help, they began a new offensive. In the Middle East, Russia was pushing into Ottoman territory from the north. The British had also made a landing in Mesopotamia to protect Persia's oil fields, and they had also sent a small army up the Tigris River to try to take Baghdad. But the army got sieged in the town of Kut along the way, and eventually surrendered. A new offensive was launched from the south with all-out desert warfare. The offensive was aided by one famous British officer, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, who helped lead the Arab tribes in a revolt that wreaked havoc on the Ottoman supply lines. By the time 1917 rolled around, everyone was exhausted. There were mutinies in the French army, the German populace was starving, and the war had drained all of Russia's supplies. There was no clear winner, and it was still anyone's war. The only question now was, who was going to break first? And the answer was Russia. Tired of not eating and mad that a crazy magic homeless guy was calling some of the shots, there was an uprising in Petrograd complete with riots and strikes. The riots turned into a full-scale revolution, and a new government overthrew the Tsar. Then a few months...
That's one thing that's very important, is your citizens eating. You can, I feel, as a country, get away to some extent with your army and your soldiers and whatnot getting a little abuse, right? When it comes to not eating properly, not having proper supplies, those types of things. It seems like that is kind of baked into their mentality and training, as that's okay, that's acceptable to some point. Everyone has a breaking point, but a military person is going to have a higher breaking point than a civilian, and they signed up for it. Well, I don't know. Were there conscriptions back then in Russia? I guess I don't know that. Maybe they didn't sign up for it. But either way, through the training, that's kind of baked in. You know, you're taught that what you're doing is for the greater good, and you're trained specifically to deal with harshness and hardships, whereas the civilians, not so much. So while your military can take some abuse, your civilians, they'll get pretty upset if they're not eating. So this revolt actually makes a lot of sense, and there was a lot more going on there too.
Months later, the Bolsheviks overthrew the new government, and they pulled Russia out of the war. This was great news for Germany, who now only had to focus on the Western Front. But there was still one problem. The pesky United States of America was looking increasingly like it was going to join the war. America had been selling supplies to the Allies throughout the war, and was getting super rich off the back of it, meaning it was in fantastic shape and was dangerous to the Germans.
War is bad for people, but war is darn good for business and the profits that war can bring. Crazy. So, you know, there's also, when you start looking at all these, we talk a lot about idealisms, we talk a lot about defending your national interest when it comes to fending off threats, but one thing that we don't talk about is the profitability of war and how that can influence a lot of who joins and where they align, all that type of things. There's been wars arguably started purely off of that profitability. So, you know, it's a big factor.
So Germany sent a telegram to Mexico saying, wouldn't it be crazy cool if you guys attacked America? But the British intercepted the message, showed it to the Americans, and that was the final straw. American troops began shipping out to Europe. This was...
I wonder if that telegram was real, or if the Britons were like, hey, you know it would probably get America in the war.
Terrible news for Germany, and they knew their only hope now was to force France and the UK to surrender before the fresh American troops arrived. It was now or never, so they started one final attack. They converged their troops and hit hard at the Somme and pushed the Allies back. They hit a second time further north, then again and again. With each hit, the Germans were spending more and more resources, while the Allies were getting better and better at repelling their attacks. By the fifth punch, the Allies held the line and even pushed back. With American troops now arriving in larger numbers, the Allies launched a counterattack, and that was it. The Central Powers were being pushed back on all fronts. Bulgaria collapsed first, followed by the Ottoman Empire, then Austria-Hungary, and finally on November 11th, 1918 at 11 o'clock, Germany surrendered. At the peace treaty, Germany was forced to reduce its military, accept war guilt, and pay the bill for the war. After indescribable suffering, reduce its military, accept war guilt, and pay the bill for
Germany should be ashamed, it says.
the war. After indescribable suffering and millions dead,
God.
the world learnt its lesson and never had such an awful war again. For about 20 years.
Right? Yes, we definitely learned our lesson from all those millions of deaths, and we just stayed calm for about 20 years. Isn't it sad that it only took that long? We never learn, do we? We never learn. This was amazing. I absolutely love these oversimplified videos. My favorite part, well, okay, first, the pacing is perfect. Absolutely perfect. They don't get into too much detail, which, as I said last time, I do want to learn more, and I do want to learn more details. But for this type of video, you can't do that for every point, because this would be, you know, a whole series, which I would watch. But that's not the point of this video, right? But the pacing is perfect because you're getting a lot of information, but you're also getting, you know, little breaks from that with humor thrown in there. And I absolutely love the humor. The humor is what makes this for me. The pacing alone, it's perfect. But to be honest, I feel like this would probably get a bit dry without that humor. So the humor sprinkled in there is the absolute perfect final touch. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. We're definitely going to do more of these. I have a gaming channel if you haven't checked that out. We play a lot of awesome games. It's linked everywhere. I really appreciate you, and I hope that you have such a wonderful day.